Yesterday, the Canadian government released a discussion paper on its controversial oil and gas emissions cap. I'm going to talk to Jan Gorski, who is the director of the Pembina Institute's oil and gas program, about that. So, welcome to the interview, Jan.
Thanks, Markham. Happy to be here.
Look, why don't you can you give us an overview of what's in the discussion paper?
Yeah, so the discussion paper really builds on the government's commitment to put a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector, and it lays out two options for doing that. The first option is to use the existing system, the output-based pricing system, which is essentially the carbon price for heavy emitters, and to essentially tweak that system and strengthen it to achieve the goals of the cap. And the other option is to develop a new system, a cap and trade system, which is something that we see in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has a cap and trade system. Quebec does as well. But this would be an entirely new policy that would interface with the existing carbon pricing rules. So those are the two options that the federal government has laid out, and they talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of each, and they're really seeking input for which option they should take going forward.
Well, let's talk about the existing carbon, the heavy emitters carbon price in Alberta, particularly, because that's where the bulk of the Canadian oil and gas emissions take place. And the first output-based carbon pricing scheme came in under the Rachel Notley's NDP government. And then the Jason Kenney's UCP government modified that in 2019 and actually diluted the impact of carbon pricing for large emitters by economist Andrew Leach estimated by about a third. But given the fact that the tier, it's called TIER, is in fact, there's an equivalency agreement between the Alberta government and the Canadian government about that. How then does the Canadian government go about modifying it without entering into negotiations with Alberta, which has been hostile to the emissions cap?
Yeah, this is a good question. And it's worth noting that right now there is a discussion in place between the federal government and the provinces to really true up the provincial carbon pricing systems to match the stringency level of the federal system. So the Alberta government right now is doing a review of tier, and they're trying to strengthen it in hopes that they can meet the federal government's equivalency criteria. But in order to meet the requirements of the cap, this would require essentially a revisiting of this to ensure that the tier doesn't just meet the requirements of the current federal system, but also the new one, basically to meet the cap policy.
And we should point out for viewers that under the output-based system, essentially because the governments are worried about carbon leakage, the producers are given like an 80 to 90% discount on the current carbon price. And so I think I read in a financial statement from Suncor, they pay about $2.50 a barrel, which at the prices around $100 a barrel is not much of an incentive to improve. So it seems to me that even at current prices, they'd almost have to do away with output-based allocation to send a real strong carbon price to meet their emission cap requirements and the goals that they've set. It seems like a huge task to ask carbon pricing to shoulder this burden all by itself.
Certainly, even to, as you said, to meet the current requirements, you're going to have to make pretty big changes to the carbon pricing system. But I think we need to make those changes anyways, because we've seen that the Pathways Alliance is committed to net zero. They're trying to move forward, or they're starting to talk about projects. And if we see a lot of these CCUS projects come online, these are going to have an impact on the credit market, because we have to remember that the carbon pricing system tier in it, there's this offset market for credits. And to keep that market functional, you need to ensure that there's enough demand and that there's enough supply. And as you said, right now the companies really they don't have to reduce emissions by much under tier. And so we really need to strengthen tier and basically make a bigger ask of the companies and facilities to make reductions, not only to meet those climate targets, but also to make sure the credit market functions, because companies are already pursuing some of these projects.
A couple of observations, Jan. One is I'm really surprised that the federal government didn't bring in some kind of an industrial policy to limit emissions. Like you remember our interview of a few months ago, where you talked about the Pembina's suggestions for ways to reduce emissions quickly, and a lot of it had to do with methane emissions, getting those down, 88% in the very short term, while working on other solutions like CCUS. So that's one thing. Why not any industrial policy? And the second thing is CCUS takes like years and years to engineer and then build the infrastructure. And there's I talked to Kevin Byrne at IHS Markit, the economist who specializes in the oil sands. And he says, maybe by the end of the 2020s, somewhere late 2020s, you might get that system up and running. So I don't know. What's your take on those observations?
Well, certainly, methane is the low-hanging fruit, as you said, and the government is developing new methane rules to get more significant, more ambitious reductions in methane. And CCUS projects do take a longer amount of time, which is why we really need to make sure that this cap policy is developed quickly, so that it's in place and it provides certainty to companies about what the policy environment will look like. But the other side of that is oil and gas companies are seeing record profits right now, and they're not reinvesting those profits into production, but they're also not reinvesting them into reducing emission. So we really need to see those companies start to put money into these projects and start this heavy lift of reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like I've been through the investor presentations from the big oil companies like Suncor and Cenovus and so on. And now we should give Cenovus its due. It is the only big company that has a plan in place. I think they're going to reduce they produce 29 megatons a year. They're going to reduce that by 10 or 15 megatons. They're the only company that says they will reduce absolute emissions before 2030. All the rest of them are, as far as I can see, it's kind of like window dressing. It's the least amount of that they can do. But the companies themselves are promising investors that they will give either somewhere between 75% and 100% of those windfall profits back to the investors. The companies have indicated to the market they have no interest whatsoever in investing big dollars in reducing their emissions. That money's going back to investors. What's going to be the impact of that if the government changes the rules?
Well, that's why we need policy to basically hold these companies accountable to their commitments. As you've said, a lot of these oil and gas companies, they've made commitments to reduce emissions. The Pathways Alliance has made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, and they have interim targets as well. But we really need to unlock those investments from the sector, because as you say, those companies right now, they're putting that money to share buybacks, into dividends. They're not investing them to reduce emissions. But it's also worth noting they're not investing them in growing production, because investors are skeptical, and investors see where demand for these products is going. They also see that to meet climate targets globally, we're going to have to reduce our reliance on oil and gas. And I think they're also becoming aware of the fact that the adoption of electric vehicles is accelerating, and the future demand for oil and gas is uncertain. And so they're a little hesitant as well. So it's worth noting that, we're not likely to see huge growth in demand for oil and gas. And so now is the time to invest in reducing emissions so that our sector can remain competitive as we transition to cleaner energy sources.
Well, fair enough. Okay, well, let's talk about the second option that the federal government has put on the table, which is the cap and trade system. And the first thing that sprang to mind was sounds like the same kind of agreement that the U.S. and Canada entered into over repairing the ozone, hole in the ozone layer. That was quite successful and reduced, I forget the chemical CFPs or whatever it was. But anyway, so is that what the government has in mind? And if it is, would it be layered on top of TIER and other large emitter carbon pricing schemes in other provinces like Saskatchewan, Newfoundland? Or is this something that is layered on or separate?
It's a good question. I mean, and I think there's still some uncertainty in what this could look like, but my sense is that the cap and trade system would work in addition to existing systems. So it'd really be layered on top. But, the details still aren't there. The government is really seeking input with this discussion paper on some of these details. But yeah.
Is it Pembina's take on this that the government would do it under the existing Canadian Environmental Protection Act of 1999, and it has the authority, the legal authority, to impose that on provincial governments?
I can't really comment on the legal aspects too much. I mean, we've seen SEPA being used before. SEPA was used in the electricity sector to place limits on coal and gas plants. So certainly it's a powerful tool, and it was used in the methane regulations as well to reduce emissions and require action.
Okay. I guess, Jan, to wrap up this discussion, what's Pembina's take on this? Does it have a preference for increasing the large emitter carbon pricing versus the cap and trade system?
Yeah, we haven't really dug into the details enough yet to be able to say which option we prefer. I think both are. It's possible to use either system. It really comes down to the details of how they're implemented. But the way we're thinking about it is more at a principles level. So we really need to move fast on this policy and implement it as soon as possible to have it in place. And the policy needs to provide certainty to companies on what the environment is going to look like so they can start investing. And the other principle is it needs to be efficient, it needs to work well with other policies and not be too cumbersome. So those are really the critical pieces that we're looking for in whatever this policy looks like.
Yeah, and I actually do have an additional question, and we saw Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage put out a statement yesterday in which she accused the federal government of not consulting, in the drafting of the paper and that sort of. And I'm really skeptical of that, because I know I interviewed Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson last month, and he said, yeah, but there's always conflict in the public eye, but behind the scenes, he says, we have a really good working relationship with the Alberta government, and they're on board. We work things out, and we're conversing. So should we be taking Sonia Savage's comments with a very large grain of salt?
It's hard to say right now what that level of discussion is, but I think this discussion paper is, this is really the start of the consultation for the federal government, and this is an opportunity for Alberta to engage with them around what this policy could look like.
Fair enough. I shouldn't be asking you political questions. Anyway, thank you very much, Jan. Really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, thanks, Markham. Thanks for having me.